NAIRU, otherwise known as the Non-Accelerating Inflation Rate of Unemployment, is a macroeconomic measure of the lowest unemployment rate that can be sustained without inflation growth. Essentially, it is an economic indicator between the unemployment and inflation that suggests an inverse relationship between the pair. That is, as unemployment decreases, inflation increases, and as unemployment increases, inflation decreases. To garner an understanding of NAIRU, we must first discuss how the fundamental notion of NAIRU was discovered. The relationship between unemployment and inflation was first discovered in 1958 when an economist from New Zealand, William Phillips, published an article titled The Relationship Between Unemployment and the Rate of Change of Money Wage Rates in the United Kingdom, 1861 to 1957. The article contained a revelation, as it discovered an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. As in the UK, within the period 1861 to 1957, it was discovered that high unemployment was associated with low inflation, as was the inverse, that is, low unemployment was associated with high inflation. This information was then represented upon a graph, the Phillips curve, wherein the axes were labeled inflation and unemployment, and the inverse relationship was portrayed visually. As a result, NAIRU thus provided a dilemma, as macroeconomic policies implemented to reduce unemployment led to an increase in inflation, whereas policies targeted at reducing inflation increased unemployment, and therefore there existed a direct conflict between the two economic factors. The NAIRU phenomenon exists because, as demand for labor increases, firms raise wages in order to recruit new workers, and hence the higher costs of production are partially passed on as higher prices of goods and services, leading to increased inflation. Therefore, if the rate of unemployment falls below the NAIRU, the shortage of labor within the economy will lead to a cycle of rising wages, leading to consecutive rises in the price of goods and services, thus leading to high inflation. Today, there exist two accepted forms of NAIRU and the Phillips curve, the short-run Phillips curve and the long-run Phillips curve. The short-run Phillips curve showcases the short-term stable relationship between inflation and unemployment. In the short run, economists recognize that as inflation and wages increase, unemployment decreases due to a phenomenon commonly referred to as the money illusion. The money illusion is a notion that suggests as wages rise, the general population are oblivious to the rising prices in the cost of goods and services. However, they have become aware of the rise in wages. Therefore, although it is not true, the population feels better off as they have perceived that their purchasing power has risen. In response to these perceived incentives, more individuals supply their labor, increasing production, reducing unemployment, and thus increasing economic growth. However, as time passes, the population comes to the realization that the extra wages earned still have the same purchasing power as the cost of all goods and services has also increased. Members of the population then proceed to revise their decisions, and unemployment falls back to the rate at which it previously was before the rise in wages. The long-run Phillips curve showcases a long-term relationship between inflation and unemployment. Upon the Phillips curve, this relationship is portrayed as a vertical line, as modern economists commonly argue that there is no long-term trade-off between unemployment and inflation. To support this notion, let us suppose that wages rose 10% year-on-year due to a labor shortage. To compensate, firms would pass on the higher wages as an increase in the price of goods and services by 10% year-on-year. Thus, it would be concludable that as the wages continue to rise, a greater amount of people would be incentivized to work, and unemployment would hence fall. However, as the cost of goods and services also increases over the same period, the purchasing power of an individual's wage has remained unchanged. Therefore, the incentive to attain employment remains the same, and thus it can be concluded that there is no change in the level of employment. However, it must be noted that although in theory there exists the foundational principles of NAIRU, in practice, NAIRU has been commonly contradicted throughout the century following its discovery. For instance, in the 1970s, in a period of stagflation, both inflation and unemployment were high in the Western world, contradictory to the foreseen conditions predicted by NAIRU, and thus discrediting the fundamental notion of the theory. Furthermore, the 1990s saw a period of low inflation and low unemployment in Western countries, further contradicting the claims made by NAIRU. Therefore, currently debate regarding the existence of the NAIRU is common within the global economic world, and it is utilized as an economic resource within various economies, whereas others refrain from using it. So, why is it important to have an understanding of this topic? Well, an understanding of NAIRU and its implications provides an insight into how the economy operates, namely the factors that affect the unemployment and inflation of an economy. The NAIRU framework thus provides reasoning for changes in unemployment and inflation throughout the Australian and global economy. Furthermore, it also aids in understanding the reasons as to the implementation of macroeconomic policies and the supposed policy goals. So, you may be wondering, although there is no long-term effect of NAIRU, why was it and why is it regarded so highly? Ultimately, it was discovered and first reported upon in a period of economic discussion wherein economists were developing new theories and models in an attempt to showcase how the economy worked, primarily on a macroeconomic scale. Therefore, the evidence provided by William Phillips within his report was commonly accepted within the global economic world, as economists and politicians utilized the revelations when implementing monetary policy, and doubts regarding NAIRU were not brought about until later within the century. Furthermore, you may also ask, although there exist doubts about the existence of NAIRU, is it used as a macroeconomic measure? Well, although the notion of NAIRU and its economic effects have been commonly contradicted throughout the past few decades, the Australian Treasury still utilises NAIRU as a measure to estimate the labour market slack, that is, the derived demand for labour in relation to available supply of workers in the economy, while also using it to estimate wages growth. However, it must be noted that NAIRU does not remain the only measure utilised by the Australian Treasury when determining labour market slack and wages growth, as various other measures of the economic indicators are also utilised. Therefore, the key takeaway points from the fundamental framework and notion of NAIRU are: NAIRU is a macroeconomic measure of the lowest unemployment rate that can be sustained without inflation growth. Essentially, it is an economic indicator that suggests an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation, which is then represented upon a graph, the Phillips curve. The notion of NAIRU thus provides a dilemma, as macroeconomic policies targeted at reducing unemployment lead to an increase in inflation, whereas policies targeted at reducing inflation increase unemployment, and hence there exists a direct conflict between the two economic factors. Currently, there are two accepted forms of NAIRU and the Phillips curve, the short-term and the long-term. The short-term form of the framework suggests that there exists a money illusion, wherein there exists a perceived notion that the purchasing power of the general population has increased, whereas the long-term form of the framework suggests that there exists no relationship between unemployment and inflation. Although there exists a theoretical framework for the existence of NAIRU, many economists believe that in practice NAIRU does not exist, as various periods of economic growth and recession have contradicted the foreseen predictions of NAIRU, yet it is continuously used to influence macroeconomic policy implementation throughout the world, including Australia.